We are your home theater and AV questions answered. This is AVRant. Want your home theater or AV question answered by Tom and Rob? Send it to question@avrant.com.
Welcome to another edition of AV Rant. My name is Rob H. I'm your host this week while Tom Andrea is away. And I'm here with...
Lee Overstreet, once again pinch hitting for the AVRant podcast. I'm happy to be here, and it's a complicated week, isn't it? For us, particularly
We are doing some new stuff behind the scenes. So if you haven't ever checked out our YouTube video, so youtube.com/AVRant, if you've never checked it out, well, I shouldn't say this is the week to do so, because this might be the worst one ever, but it might also be the best one ever, possibly.
We literally don't know what's really happening right now.
We don't really know. As far as I can tell, things are working. So I have switched over to OBS, and some people are going to be rolling their eyes. They're like, yeah, of course, that's what everybody has used for years. Why are you so far behind the times, Rob? And it's simply because the whole thing started, Tom and I needed to talk to each other some way. We weren't particularly huge fans of Skype, so we're like, hey, there's this thing, Google Hangouts, and it's like, oh, there's a record button right there. You press that, and it automatically makes a YouTube video for you.
And it was so cool. It would switch back and forth between the speaker, whoever was talking. It would cut camera back and forth automatically.
It was very easy, and it automatically generated a YouTube video. But then, YouTube videos sort of became a part of our show. This is AV Rant, by the way, the podcast that answers your home theater and AV questions. Because I haven't said that, because I'm all befuddled, man. I am befuddled.
Let's just do the podcast. Let's trust it's all going to work.
We're
magic.
Explaining what's going on. Anyway, Lee and I might be side by side in even the behind the scenes live one. The pictures should show up for the live crowd, like people have been requesting for ages, and they're like, use OBS, Rob. It's really easy. Well, I'm learning it all on the fly here, folks. So that's the way it is.
That's right.
But yes, welcome here, AV Rant. It's your home theater and AV questions answered. And to get your questions answered, all you have to do is send them over to question@avrant.com. That is our email address. You can also reach us on Facebook. That's facebook.com/AVRant Podcast. And if you want to reach us individually, well, before I say that, I should mention avrant.com, our website. In case you couldn't figure it out from question@avrant.com, there is an avrant.com. That's our website. But you can reach Tom individually. He's tom@avrant.com. His Twitter is @avrant_Tom. You can reach me. I'm rob@avrant.com for email, and I am @FirstReflect on Twitter. And here is Lee, who, if you're watching the YouTube video, even the live one, he should actually have his Twitter handle posted down below, because Ash, who is an awesome AVRant listener, created graphics because he knew this day would come. He had faith that this day would one day come.
That's amazing.
When Lee would be.
He just knew. Me. He led us to this. That was our destiny. Yes, I'm @LeeOverTweet. That's my clever little Twitter handle, because my name is Overstreet. And I'll just go ahead and say on Instagram, I'm Lee Overgram. Enough people have started to notice me there that listen here. And it's not super exciting. It's, stupid pictures of my life, but that's fun too. But @LeeOverTweet, you can tweet me, direct message if you got questions, if I can help you with something. I did have people contact me about digitizing old home videos, and that was kind of fun.
Good stuff. Yeah. I can tell you right now, the showing of these pictures, I'm going to have to get used to that. That is not going to be easy for me. Anyway.
It's going to be strange. Yes. That's right. Oh, wait. One more bit of contact information for me. My YouTube channel, if you're curious, The Lee Overstreet. I couldn't get Lee Overtube.
Yeah.
That would have been great.
Somebody had taken Lee Overtube. Is that?
No, it's just I created this before I got smart. I created the YouTube account a long time ago and didn't do anything with it.
Understood.
But I'm The Lee Overstreet on YouTube. Just for fun.
Very good. Okay, well... I mentioned Ash, who created the graphics, so thank you for that. And we'd like to thank anybody who supports this podcast in any way. We call them our listeners of the week. Now, for this week and next week, I'm not going to be able to say who donated to us on PayPal, because the only person who can see that is Tom. This podcast does, he owns this podcast. It is his property. I am merely the co-host. So apologies to anyone who has donated to us on PayPal. Your names will be mentioned as soon as Tom is back a couple weeks from now. But But if you would like to donate to this podcast via PayPal in the meantime, just come to our website, avrant.com, and over on the right-hand side, it says support AVRant, and there's a graphic of a cup of coffee, and that'll take you over to PayPal where you can give us a donation, any amount you like, using your credit card or your PayPal account, of course. And then another way people like to support us is on Patreon. We have 82 patrons over there, including Brandon W., who let me know this week that he is one of our patrons. So that's patreon.com/AVRant Podcast if you'd like to sign up. It's like a voluntary subscription. It's an automatic monthly donation. You say the dollar amount that you want to automatically send to us every single month, and Patreon takes care of the rest. So thanks very much to our 82 patrons over there, including Brandon W. And
apparently we also accept Amazon gift cards.
Absolutely. I will. All of us will happily take an Amazon gift card. That definitely works. That was last week.
But $0 is required to get your question answered.
Yes. No, this is all voluntary, but we appreciate the support. Brandon W. also supported us in another way. If you're not supporting us financially or just want to help out the podcast in some way, if you buy a product from somebody, let them know. And that's what Brandon did. He bought some Hios products over at Accessories for Less, and he let them know that he heard about them from us. So
surely they know about us. They must be quite familiar with us by now at Accessories for Less.
Definitely knows about us over at Accessories for Less. That's a good relationship, and we're happy about that. So before we get into the rest of the podcast here, I want to mention next week, I will also have another guest co-host, but it's going to be someone who has never appeared on AVRant before, and that is Richard Gunther from the Home On podcast. He's a member of the Digital Media Zone. He also appears on the Entertainment 2.0 podcast. Now, I've been a guest on Entertainment 2.0 a number of times. The co-host with Richard on that podcast is Josh Pollard. Josh Pollard did appear on AVRant once long ago. He's overdue to come back, but Richard has never been here, so Richard is going to be here next week. He's going to be recording with me on July 24th, and Richard is a do-it-yourself home automation expert. So all of your home automation questions that you might have, now is the time to send them in. We've got, I think, 3 that came in so far, so that's a nice start. We'll be answering your regular home theater questions that come in as well, but we're going to prioritize questions that are sent in for Richard, so please do so. Now's the time. I
may have a couple for him. I didn't know that. This is great.
Email them. That's going to be good. Can I get back to this picture? Question@avrant.com. Can I do that? Nope, I can't do it. I'm too slow. There it is. Yeah, see how that long that took? Learning OBS here, folks.
Again, if you're just listening and not watching, you're missing out on a lot of fun confusion on YouTube.
Oh, man, oh, man. Okay, so enough of that. The news.
Shall we talk about the news?
Did you want to read the news? Because that'll give me time to load up more pictures.
You load up things. You've got a lot of question answering to do. I'm happy to read the news.
Awesome.
Hisense, that's the Chinese company Hisense, launched their 65-inch ULED XD, not OLED, ULED dual layer LCD TV. I remember talking about this, but only in China. The price conversion works out to something around $2,500. It uses a 1080p black and white LCD panel behind a 4K full color LCD panel. So it creates like 2 million local dimming zones. Other sizes and availability outside of China are expected next year. And that's, I don't know what to think. It just seems like all these struggles to make LCDs as good as OLEDs already are.
Yeah, I mean, there's limitations.
And the fact that they call it a ULED, kind of like how Samsung has QLED, they're all trying to imply we're kind of like OLED.
I know, they kind of keep aping that name, don't they?
Except they don't have burn-in. Okay.
Yeah, no burn-in. So, I mean, by all accounts, when the prototypes of these were shown at CES, people were like, yep, it's very effective. There's still a teeny tiny little bit of blooming because it is a 1080p panel doing the strictly black and white light modulation as opposed to, but they're saying, in the future, they're planning to have 2 4K panels, one black and white 4K panel, a color black and white 4K panel on top of that. But it wasn't clear at the time whether this was going to be a consumer product that was available. The viewing angles to the sides and up and down do seem to be very limited. Yeah, because now it's going through 2 panels to get to you.
Yeah.
But yeah, basically, this is sort of the ultimate version of local dimming, if you want to think of it that way. The backlight can more or less just stay on, although you can also, I suppose, have full array local dimming for the backlight too. You could go absolutely nuts.
Can you make like 8 million LEDs?
Well, that's a micro LED display. That's exactly what Samsung and others, Sony and LG, are also working on that. But that would be the micro LED display where every single sub pixel is its own individual LED. So that maybe one day in the future that will be the display. But
it's got to be crazy
for now,
expensive.
dual layer LCDs are a real thing that people in China can buy right now, and hopefully us next year.
All right, a few more news stories. Hulu restarted streaming its original shows in 4K. Back in 2016, 4K Hulu was available on the Xbox One and PlayStation 4, but then it just kind of went away in 2018. Now it's back, but only on the Apple TV 4K and Chromecast Ultra. That's just very specific. Can't use it on your Android operating system TV or any others. It's just those two devices. And it's just 4K resolution, but not HDR.
That's right. Yes.
So I'm kind of meh. Because, to be honest, 1080p, if it's done right, looks pretty amazing. If it's not compressed very much.
I guess it's a start. I don't know if Disney has any... if any of this is because of Disney's ownership of Hulu at this point, or if this was just, it was already in the works and they just kind of rolled it out. That's kind of what I suspect. This doesn't seem like something that Disney would have mandated this quickly. But the next news story tells Disney definitely is looking to expand what Hulu is going to be.
Yeah, Disney is shutting down the FX Plus streaming service for that channel and its content, but it's moving all the FX content over to Hulu. And was this the piece of news that they just revealed to like one random dude on Twitter?
No, you know what? That was the 4K thing. That was
the 4K thing. Yeah, they just kind of randomly told one guy. Hulu's not sure what they want to do. We actually just recently started subscribing to Hulu, but it's only because my wife wants to get that new Veronica Mars.
Yep, there it is.
And that's what gets you. When you're a big fan of something and it's on one of these particular streaming services, it seems like that's the kind of competition we're going to see in the future. Who's got the show you want? Because otherwise, it's pretty similar one to another.
I mean, for me, it always came down to I don't really care about channels. I care about shows.
Right.
Yeah, but
well, that's what we're getting to. So we have, we do what everybody does. You get Netflix from mom, right? And then you get Amazon Prime because you were already paying for the free shipping and all that stuff, right? Yep. So we have Amazon Prime Video, and my wife gets an educator discount there. And so now we've got Hulu, and we spend a lot on entertainment. So moving on. Nintendo announced their new Switch Lite console is coming out September 20th. It's $200 to get the price down. The Switch Lite, and that's Lite.
Yes.
Is handheld only. There's no way to use it with a television. It's smaller, lighter, a 5.5-inch screen instead of 6.2-inch screen. No rumble, no motion controls, and no kickstand. This is just a thing in your hand. And you know that it's just an expensive toy because it comes in gray, yellow, and turquoise. Out of the box, it'll only work with Switch games that work in handheld mode, but you can still sync separate Joy-Con controllers if you're playing a game that requires motion controls and rumble, like Mario Party, for example. What's Mario Party, Rob? I don't even know.
You don't know Mario Party?
I don't know Mario Party. See, dude, I can't really play games the same way an alcoholic can't drink alcohol. Once an addict, always an addict. So I don't know. Explain it to me. What's a Mario Party?
That's been around for ages. It's basically a series of mini games. The whole conceit is that it looks like a board game you play with 3 other people. So there's 4 players, and you take your players around a board game, and as you land on spaces, that triggers little mini games, and you try to collect stars and coins along the way, and whoever has the most stars and coins in the end wins. But in the most recent version of Mario Party on the Switch, it's almost entirely random, because at the very end of the game, they hand out 2 random stars. Stars count for way more than coins. They hand out 2 random stars. You have no idea what the criteria for them will be, and that pretty much decides who wins. Is random chance.
Well, it's no fun, really. I don't know. Everybody gets a gold star.
Pretty much.
Some comments, by the way, coming in. Dave on Twitter found a playlist on Spotify that is all sweeps and test tones. That's kind of cool, and we'll link to that. My only question about that is there's that limitation, like if you have free Spotify, you're maxed out at 160 kilobits per second. Is that going to mess with these test tones? I guess maybe not the simple sine wave.
I mean, a sine wave, it shouldn't mess with that. I don't know if all the levels have been equalized across all of these test tones. That's kind of an important thing.
Right. But still, just to get an idea, that's kind of neat.
If you were like, I want to get some sweeps and I want to get some test tones, that could be a very convenient way to do it.
Right.
And I just like the fact that when somebody found sweeps and test tones, their first thought was to talk about me. So I enjoy that. I think that's very appropriate.
When you think Rob, you think test tone.
That's kind of what I want. That's the legacy I'd like to leave behind. So that's good. I appreciate that.
All right. So I guess we're moving on to actual questions.
That's what's going to happen. I'm still not fully
this.
on with how this picture stuff is going to work. Good times, folks.
Okay.
Good times.
That's okay. I can describe things. You can just describe things. Just pretend it's the 1930s and all we have is radio. We are still an audio podcast. So, okay, question from last week. Let's just see how this goes. Chad B. Chad uses a Denon X6400H in his living room theater. The room's open at the back to his kitchen. He likes to have music playing when people are over, and until now, he's just cranked the volume of his theater setup so that it's easy to hear in the kitchen. But he'd also like to have the same music playing in his master bedroom. And the X6400H has all those extra zone outputs. So he was thinking he could just put a pair of speakers facing into his kitchen and another pair of speakers in his bedroom, but he'd like to send those signals wirelessly. So what should he do? Connect the Zone 2 and Zone 3 outputs to wireless transmitters and then have wireless receiving units and stereo amps for the additional pairs of speakers? Wouldn't he end up with different delays so that the sound in the living room isn't perfectly synced? What's the best way to set all this up? I'm fascinated that he wants to have it jamming in the bedroom and the kitchen at the same time.
Yeah, and the living room still. So, at the moment, it's living room only. He's cranking it up. Definitely not jamming away in the bedroom with just that. And anybody who's in the living room is kind of being deafened because he's making it loud enough to hear from his kitchen. We've got a photo that's showing the image from his kitchen looking into his living room on the side. So it's certainly open, but there's sort of a little half wall kind of dividing the area between the kitchen, dining room area and the living room.
Mm-hmm.
And he's drawn in a little graphic of where he'd like to put a pair of speakers. Now, I think he's perhaps overcomplicating this a bit because I don't really see any reason to use the zone controls on that AV receiver. It's got HEOS, and I would just go HEOS. That is definitely the easiest solution here.
Wouldn't that, by its nature, be synced if you had the HEOS
Yes,
speaker?
it will. You'll do it all through the HEOS app, so you will need a smartphone, and you'll need to control this all through the HEOS app, but there, it's very easy. So what you'll do is you'll designate that you have. So, I mean, they've got different speakers available, standalone wireless speakers. They've got the HEOS 1, HEOS 3, HEOS 5, and HEOS 7. They get physically larger as you go up in number. So you could get a pair of the HEOS 1 if you genuinely want a pair of speakers, or a pair of HEOS 3 can work as well. The 5 and 7 are more or less meant to just be on their own. They're quite large and can fill a pretty decently sized space. But what you'll have inside the HEOS app is your Denon AV receiver, your X6400H, that'll be one HEOS source and playback device. Then you'll have your HEOS speaker that you can put here on the table facing into the kitchen, and you can have another pair or single HEOS speaker in the bedroom, and you can just group those all together and say, all of you play the same source right now, and they will do so in perfect synchronicity wirelessly.
In fact, can't you just literally say it to Alexa?
Yes. Well, you know what? I haven't.
Oh, I shouldn't have said the word. I said her name out loud.
The Amazon
Sorry,
voice
everyone.
assistant. Yeah. Let's see. Yeah, that they definitely have integration with the Denon products and HEOS. I haven't personally used it with the HEOS app, so I don't know if it's one of those things where you have to say, she who shall not be named, trigger her name, ask whatever to do this, because sometimes you have to use that language to get that to work. I'm not sure if that's the way it goes, but I mean, regardless, you can definitely use the HEOS app, and Leah's right that you can probably use the A lady to
I think you can. I think even Denon brags about that on their website.
Yeah, well, you can certainly control the Denon receiver itself. I mean, basic controls, not all your complicated setup and Odyssey and all that, not the setup side of things, but the controlling the volume, turning on, switching inputs, all of that stuff you can definitely do via voice. And I'm pretty sure it does work with HEOS as well. But you know what? If I'm wrong about that, I apologize. There's a chance.
I think it does. So then Chad, for instance, could say something like, a word, play Barry White in the bedroom.
Right.
For an example.
Yeah.
Just a
you have to do the
okay.
It might be a little more complicated than that. I know you can for sure do it through the app, but I mean, regardless, that I think is the solution, Chad, is to go with HEOS. That's exactly what this is meant for. It's sort of ideal for the situation that you've described, and I wouldn't get into trying to connect things to the zone pre-outs on the X6400H. It's just not necessary.
Just makes it way more complicated. So, David F. has a question. David snagged the refurbished Epson 5040 UB projector that we talked about a couple of weeks ago. So now he has a 4K HDR compatible display. Awesome. We said to pair it with an Apple TV 4K, but he doesn't want to do that. He doesn't own any other Apple products, and he loves having his home theater PC as a single source that does everything. I understand. But now he would like Ultra HD Blu-ray playback capability. He'd be willing to get a standalone player. He's thinking that could also provide 4K HDR Netflix and Amazon. Or he was thinking he could add an Ultra HD Blu-ray drive and new graphics card to his home theater PC. He isn't too keen on getting into the whole backing up discs and playing them with Plex thing. Thoughts? My first thought is a standalone player, but you know, if you're into the physical medium, you may just get a standalone player.
Yeah, I've got several thoughts on this here, David.
There's a lot of thoughts to talk about.
Yeah, you might not like everything I have to say. Okay, let's see. Where should I begin on this? Let's imagine that what he wants to do is use nothing but his home theater PC. He's not going to get a standalone player. He's not going to get an Apple TV 4K. He's just going to continue using his home theater PC as his sole and only source. Now, you certainly can play back Ultra HD Blu-rays from a PC.
But it needs a specific video card,
well,
right?
Actually, no. Not video card.
Oh.
So the only game in town for playing back actual, you buy it at a store, Ultra HD Blu-ray discs, is Cyberlink's Power DVD software. And it has to be Power DVD Ultra or their subscription service. You can either do it as a subscription or purchase the Ultra package, but that is the only way, that is the only software to play back Ultra HD Blu-rays. That costs about $100. Now, you can use then Cyberlink's specifications for what your computer hardware needs to be to play back Ultra HD Blu-ray discs. And the situation there is that there is no graphics card, separate graphics card that will work. It has to be integrated Intel graphics. That is the only...
So you'd have to have your Intel integrated graphics running at the same time as your nice video card.
That's right.
And have two separate outputs and take your motherboard's output to your television.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay.
For Ultra HD Blu-rays, you'd have to use the motherboard's HDMI output. Now, of course, that means this has to be a motherboard that has an HDMI output that has HDCP 2.2, and it has to support Intel and Microsoft's DRM. So there's a list.
So was that going to require Windows 10?
It has to be Windows 10.
Yeah.
It has to be at least an Intel 7th generation or newer. We're now up to the 9th generation, but has to be a 7th, 8th, or 9th generation processor.
Do the AMD Ryzen
There is no support for AMD.
Oh my God.
So it's got to be Intel. It's got to be at least 7th generation. Your motherboard has to support HDCP 2.2 and the Microsoft DRM and Intel DRM. So all of that stuff is listed on Cyberlink's website, but I don't know what hardware you're using in your home theater PC. This might be a significant... I mean, if you're talking about replacing the motherboard and CPU, that's
just a new computer.
Basically a new computer. Yeah. And of course, you would have to have an optical drive that you can read Ultra HD Blu-rays. And you would want one that the Cyberlink software supports. So that would be a fully licensed Ultra HD Blu-ray optical drive that you would be installing, which would not allow you to back up Ultra HD Blu-rays. Those drives have protection on them, so you couldn't use that same optical drive to do backups if you ever decide that you want to. He says he's not really into that, but... You're seeing it's quite a bit that could be involved in turning your home theater PC into an Ultra HD Blu-ray player, and it might not be inexpensive. But if you've already got the Intel processor and motherboard that support this, it's just the optical drive. And then if you ever do want to back them up, you'd have to get another optical drive that is a what we call UHD friendly drive, which is one that is physically capable of reading the discs, but is not actually licensed to do so.
So it's almost like you'd have two computers in one. You'd have one with a, quote, friendly drive and a good video card for like gaming and whatnot. And so you'd have your motherboard's output for video for your Ultra HD Blu-rays.
Yes, with the optical drive that is just for that.
So you'd have one computer with two HDMI outs going to your receiver. And you'd switch depending on if you wanted to see the computer play a UHD disc.
That's right.
Or do other things.
That's right. And then, I am assuming you're still going to be wanting to use some streaming services like, say, Netflix and Amazon and Hulu and Vudu and all of those. And, I mean, essentially, if you have the hardware that can support Ultra HD Blu-ray disc playback, that very same hardware will work with almost any streaming service. So you're basically okay there. There are certain graphics cards, mostly from NVIDIA, that will work with Netflix and Amazon and that. But it's almost like, you know what? I'm watching video right now. Why don't I just use the Intel graphics? Because those work with basically all of those things. And then when it's...
Yeah, they do fine.
If you actually are gaming, then you switch over to your discrete graphics card. But there's one other wrinkle to all of that, which is he has an Epson 5040 UB, which is, now that's been replaced by the 5050 UB. And the differentiator between the 5040 and the 5050 is that the 5040 had 10.2 gigabits per second input on its HDMI inputs, and the new 5050 has the full 18 gigabits per second. What does that mean? Well, on the 5040, with its lower bandwidth, the 10.2 gigabits, you can still watch 4K in HDR. You can still do it, but not at 60 hertz. You would have to limit...
All right. So movies would be okay.
Movies would be fine. And Netflix would be fine. It's in 24.
Depending, yeah.
The stuff that's actually...
But what all the movies,
but what you'd want to really do is set your PC to output 24 hertz, or actually the 23.976 hertz setting is what you really want.
Could you set just that video output to do?
You could. You 24? Could set just the Intel video output to do that.
And the other one to do 60
and
or whatever you wanted.
And your discrete graphics card to do 60 or higher, because if you're gaming, it might be a lot more. So, complicated, but it could all be done in just the home theater PC. But that Epson throws that little wrinkle in there, in that you'd want to set the PC itself to output 24 frames a second, because if it ever switches to 60, you're going to get a black screen when it's 4K HDR content. So, a little bit complicated. Ooh. So now, let's go... standalone player. All right, standalone player obviously will play Ultra HD Blu-ray discs. And then he's saying...
Without having to worry.
Yeah, he wants something to also stream. Now, same restriction, you're going to want to limit the player to outputting 24 frames per second. And that's where you run into problems. Because you'd want to get a Panasonic. There's really no other player I would recommend to you, particularly for a projector, but, I mean... There almost isn't any reason to go anything other than a Panasonic Ultra HD Blu-ray player. In the United States, you'd be getting the 820, which costs about $500. But it really is the player you want, especially when you're connecting to a projector, because it can do the HDR tone mapping inside of the player and send a lovely signal out to the projector that'll look fabulous. And for the discs, you can set it to output 24 frames per second and everything is fine. The problem is the Panasonic UB820 player has only 3 streaming services built into it in the United States, one of which is YouTube, the other one is Netflix, and the other one is Amazon. So if you want Hulu or Vudu, it doesn't have those available. And worse than all of that, it will only output those at 60 frames per second, which means problems for your Epson 5040 UB. What ends up being my recommendation? David, I really want you to get an Apple TV 4K for all of your streaming stuff, because it is the streaming box that will connect to your Epson 5040 UB. You can limit the Apple TV 4K to only output 420 chroma, which helps lower your bandwidth, to automatically change frame rates so that when it's 24 frames a second, it's 24 frames a second, to automatically change dynamic range so that when it's SDR, it's SDR, and when it's HDR, it's HDR. And you don't have to have any other Apple devices, and you don't even have to sign up for an Apple ID if you aren't using iTunes or the Apple TV app. If you're just using the Apple TV 4K to be a Netflix, Amazon, Vudu, Hulu playback device, you can just use it as that. You don't have to...
So just cover the Apple logo
I mean, it seems like he just
with a
doesn't like Apple, which that's fine. I can understand some people don't.
Right.
And I certainly understand not wanting to be drawn into the Apple ecosystem if you just don't want any part of that.
See, that's my thing. I hated...
Right.
It's past tense now, right? I hated iTunes, and I don't like their ecosystem. It's not that it's not hate so much. I just don't get it. I don't like it. I didn't come up using Apple products. So I kind of understand the hesitancy, but if you tell me that this is just a standalone doohickey that happens to be made by Apple and I can use it to do all that, clearly that's a lot
And I mean,
easier.
that would be all your streaming services. Now, of course, the Apple TV 4K doesn't play back physical Ultra HD Blu-ray discs, but now, if we're not super worried about having streaming built in, now I could point you to Sony's X800. I wouldn't point you to the M2. There's no reason to get the M2 version. Just find one of the older Sony X800s, and that combined price of the Sony X800 Ultra HD Blu-ray disc player, which you would just use to play physical discs, and the Apple TV 4K, which you would just use for streaming services and never sign up for anything Apple, that combined price is like $450. So it's less than the standalone player. It's probably less than what you would pay to add all the stuff you need to your home theater PC, because the software is $100. The optical disc drive is about $100. In fact, I think the licensed ones are about $150 because they're more expensive than the UHD friendlies. So, I mean, it really is the answer. The reason I recommended the Apple TV 4K as your streaming device is because I really genuinely think it is by far the best choice. That's kind of it. Is
the Chromecast Ultra able to do these things, to output correctly to this projector? I don't know that specific about, because I know certainly you get all the streaming that you want. I just don't know if it has the same nuanced output as that Apple.
And it's also like
TV.
Atmos support, I don't think is there for all of them. Whereas on the Apple TV 4K, if it's a streaming service that offers Atmos, it supports it. Yeah, the Chromecast Ultra, I mean, it's one of those things where there's like one or two services where there's one or two features you might want that it doesn't support. I mean, to me, the Apple TV 4K is just the safe choice because for everything except for...
Because the Chromecast Ultra is really cheap.
It is, yeah.
$100.
Yeah, but I'm not sure about the frame rate switching. I'm not sure about Atmos audio. Atmos audio support is a real question mark because that I don't think is the case. Whereas the Apple TV 4K, I know it does all those things. Yeah. There you go, David. I'm reiterating one.
Then that's... So anybody looking to do anything near this, that's a lot of information we just gave them. So there you go, David. That's a lot of answer. Brandon N is our next questioner. Brandon has an open concept theater area. He was thinking of getting an SVS PC-4000, but he spotted an outlet sale on a PC-13 Ultra. It would save him a lot of money. Is the PC-13 Ultra, quote, close enough?
Is 2 decibels at about 18 hertz close enough?
That's close enough.
The PC-4000 is an upgrade. It's about 2 decibels louder than the PC-13 Ultra at about 18 hertz. Everywhere above that, maybe 1.5 decibels louder, up to maybe about 22 hertz. It does.
And if you're already in a big open space, you're already not so much pressurizing that space anyway.
I'm probably not right down at 20 hertz. Probably not. No, they are very, very close. Now, of course, the PC-4000 does allow you to use SVS's smartphone app to do all the setup, and the PC-13 Ultra does not. So
but it says it would save him a lot of money.
And the PC-13 Ultra, which is the subs that I have, they have a really good, in my opinion, manual control system on the back. It's actually all kind of done through a single knob that is a button and a knob, and it's just a series of presses and knob turns to change all of the menu settings in there, and it's really good. It's quite intuitive and it works really well. It's just you can't do it from your seat holding your phone in your hand like you could with the PC-4000. So output wise, very close. Yes, the PC-4000 can play ever so slightly lower and louder, but I would certainly think the PC-13 Ultra, as far as output, is close enough.
All right. He also asks, what is timbre? We talk about timbre matching for the 3 front speakers. Is it more than just what you'd see in a frequency response curve? If 2 different speakers showed the exact same frequency response curve, would they have the exact same timbre, or is there something more to it? Well, of course, the audiophiles would tell you there's so much more to it. But if they measure exactly the same, my guess is it's kind of the same timbre.
Well, I mean, what is timbre? Timbre is, I think the easiest way I can explain it is think of some musical instruments in an orchestra, say a trumpet and a violin and a clarinet. They are all capable of playing the exact same note, right? The note on the sheet music is the same. All of those instruments can play within that same range to play that exact same note in the exact same octave. But none of us would mistake a trumpet playing concert A for a violin playing concert A for a clarinet playing concert A. They're all playing concert A in the same octave, but they sound different. And that difference in sound is all because of harmonics. The instrument itself, the body of each of those instruments is producing different harmonics. So the note that's written on the page, that is the fundamental. If you played strictly that note all by itself, it would just be a sine wave at that one particular frequency, and it would just be the beeping sound of a sine wave. And all of those instruments are playing that sine wave as the fundamental of that note. But then there are all these harmonics layered on top of that come from the bodies of those instruments, ringing in sympathy with that fundamental note. So all of those harmonics are the timbre of that instrument. Two people singing the same note, but two different voices, and we can tell them apart. Why? Different harmonics from their physical body, their vocal folds, making the same fundamental, but all the harmonics on top of it give each of us our distinct voice when we're singing.
I've always thought of it as the character of the sound.
The character,
so
the color, there are other words that can be used, but that is what timbre means. It is all of the harmonics on top of the fundamental that give it the unique sound of that instrument or that voice, even though they're all playing the same fundamental, which is just a sine wave, right?
If you had two different speakers from two different manufacturers that were somehow magically perfect speakers, perfect, they played exactly the sound wave you fed them, then they would timbre match perfectly, no matter how they were shaped. But that doesn't happen because the world is the world.
Speakers are made out of different moving cones and domes and sometimes ribbons or whatever the thing is that's moving. It does not move perfectly as a sine wave. It imparts some small amount or a fairly large amount of harmonics to the fundamental frequency that's being played. That would create a timbre to just the driver of that speaker. Then go ahead. Yeah, that driver is inside of a cabinet, which is not completely inert. It produces some small or sometimes large amount of harmonics. There might be a port on that speaker, which also produces some harmonics. So all of these things add up. Now, yes, a theoretically perfect speaker would be a mathematical point with no physicalness to it that moves only in response to the electrical signal with nothing else, no harmonics produced outside of it, but we don't have that type of perfection.
So if aliens create a speaker in another dimension that appears to you as a point source and sounds perfect, there you go, it'll match anything. So by the way, his next question is sort of already answered by just what you described. He's asking, if two speakers have essentially identical frequency response, what accounts for differences in imaging and soundstage? Is it dispersion, room interaction, something else? All of those things affect the sound, while the room interaction can make a difference to two different speakers.
Very much so.
The speakers themselves, as the sound comes out, bounces around the room, comes back to the speaker, bounces off the speaker again, all those things affect.
Yeah, I mean, if you're looking at a frequency response graph and just trying to visually tell from that is not capturing everything. Right? A frequency response graph, even if you say it's unsmoothed or whatever, I mean, there can be very small differences, again, with these little bits of harmonics and that wouldn't necessarily be visually obvious. I guess maybe you could zoom way into the waveform and really peep it down, but man, oh man, you'd have to know what you're looking for. If you overlaid them, you would see, even though the overall shape of the line might be identical, when you zoom way in, you're going to see some little variations in the waveform. That is the timbre of each speaker. But more than this, I mean, he's saying what creates a difference in image and sound staging, and that is definitely more than just frequency response. That is definitely dispersion is a huge part of that. Because some speakers... And
definitely room interaction.
Room interaction is definitely a part of that. What they would call the power envelope, right? How much sound is being thrown behind, to the sides, to the top, to the bottom of the speaker, as opposed to coming, directly forward in a straight line from the drivers of the speaker to your ear. That is part of the dispersion, but it's also the power envelope all around the speaker. What else can it be? It can also be the time domain response, right? The transient response. If something is starting and stopping in response to the signal faster than the other speaker, then that can help to create more pinpoint imaging within whatever soundstage it's creating. So there are these differences other than just frequency response to a speaker. And ultimately, if you're looking at two different speakers, as we explained when we're talking about timbre, if you zoom way in, it's pretty hard for them to actually be identical. There's going to be some small differences.
Yeah, speakers are still the one analog thing, even if you're listening to all digital sources and have a very good amp. the speaker is going to be the biggest difference between two people's systems that went out and bought like a Denon and a Yamaha and bought, they're listening to
all,
the same
all the upstream
digital
stuff,
sources.
the amplifiers, the AV receivers. I mean, unless you're applying equalization to the signal, those things make so little difference.
So little. Your speaker cables don't make a difference. Your interconnects, all that, the HDMI cables, none of that. But boy, speakers still
can
have
make
character.
A difference. That's right.
And it does, you can like a brand, and I've noticed that certain brands, you tend to like everything they do in varying amounts. It's like breweries.
Okay.
Like, I like everything from this brewery. I get those people. Their taste buds are like mine. And this other one, ew, no, I don't like that at all. Too bitter. Moving on, if you can find an inexpensive speaker with linear and accurate response, what would be the benefits offered by more expensive speakers? Well, the case is you rarely can find an inexpensive speaker with linear and accurate response.
But I mean, there are some where I would say what they're producing is linear. What they're producing is, so accurate. There's degrees of accuracy, aren't there?
Yeah. Right.
So, but certainly you can find inexpensive speakers that are quite linear. But again, there's more to it than just frequency response. But I mean, what are you really looking for? I mean, really inexpensive speakers straight up cannot produce all the sounds that are requested of them by the signal. They just can't do it. There's sounds at the top, there's sounds at the bottom, sometimes sounds in the middle, hopefully not, but definitely sounds at the top, sounds at the bottom that they literally just cannot produce. And so you aren't even producing the full signal. And as you move up to what I would call a good mid-range, not expensive, but not super cheap speaker, you will get to a speaker that can actually make all the sounds that the signal is asking it to make. Well, maybe not the deep bass, because we're always going to tell you to use subwoofers to play the deep bass, but everything above the crossover frequency all the way up to 20 kilohertz, it can actually play all those sounds and play them linearly. And now we're at what I would definitely call a good speaker. It's making all the sounds. What can you get beyond that? Well, now you're actually talking about removing extraneous sounds that aren't supposed to be there. That, to me, is what the refinement of a more expensive, more advanced speaker and components within that speaker would be. It's actually getting that transient response to be faster. It's lowering the harmonics, right? We look at the harmonic distortion. That's what those are. It's lowering the harmonics. You're never going to eliminate them, but you can make them lesser.
Speaker cabinets that are heavier and denser and don't resonate as much.
They're producing less harmonics. They're producing faster transient response because they're not ringing in response to that note. So to me, that's what you're getting. That's what I would call the refinement of a speaker. You finally get to a speaker that makes all the sounds. Now we get rid of all the sounds that aren't supposed to be there.
He's got a few more questions. Scrolling. He's in his open concept room and he's sitting about 13 feet away from his speakers. So I'm setting the scene. He's got golden ear Triton 2 towers. All right. And he's brought in a pair of Ascend Sierra towers to audition against them. He's powering either pair of speakers with a Marantz SR7011. He's found that both pairs of speakers seem to suffer, and he puts suffer in quotes, suffer when pushed to very high volumes. The imaging and soundstage seem to break down, with both pairs of towers sounding like they're playing at him when he cranks the volume up high, like screaming the sound at him. Would more amplification power help? Would room treatments help? Maybe on both.
Yeah, it is maybe on both. That's absolutely right. So, I mean, you are far enough away and in a large room where you're not necessarily getting a lot of reinforcement from room reflections, let's say. You are mostly hearing direct sound, and you're sitting far enough away that in this case, those speakers might be requesting, if you're talking about turning it all the way up to 105 decibel peaks, right? Full reference volume, that those actual 105 decibel peaks themselves could be requesting for a very short amount of time, upwards of 400 watts. Which would mean, any amplifier that is rated to continuously deliver, I mean, if it's rated to continuously deliver 200 watts, it will easily deliver 400 watts for a very short amount of time. And most amplifiers are capable of about 6 decibels of peak power for a very short amount of time, not just 3. So that would be like a 100 watt, a genuine sustained 100 watt amplifier can almost certainly deliver a very short 400 watt peak. Now, if you have all of your speakers right now being powered by one AV receiver, if 1 or 2 speakers are requesting that kind of power, I mean, the full 400 watts, the 7011 just can't get there. It'll top out in its peak power around, about 320, 330, something like that, for its momentary peak power to one speaker at a time. But if two speakers, your front, left, and right, are both requesting 105 at the same time, both of them are requesting 400 watts each for a very short amount of time, mathematically, your Marantz just can't deliver that. And external amplifier that can truly deliver 100 watts sustained all the time could do that. So you don't have to go nuts. Easily one of Outlaw's amplifiers, the Model 5000, say, something like that, could quite easily do this. The Emotiva amplifiers could definitely. By
the way, I have a similar thing. Remember me telling you about how my amplifier shut down one time watching Interstellar?
Yes.
And I had it at about -6 from a little bit off of. It did it again.
Okay.
It did it again at about -10 because I was watching Apollo 11. And the Saturn V was taking off. And I was like, this sounds great. And then click, gone.
And you aren't using additional subwoofers to take any of the load off of your speakers and amplifier that's built into your AV receiver. So you might be requesting for that moment 500-600 watts. It's entirely possible.
Yeah, might be. And that poor thing is rated at like 90 watts. And so I'm thinking I'm going to upgrade receivers anyway because my HDMI output is screwed up. So, so I'm running things weird right now. So I'm going to look for one that rates higher on the power output. And if that doesn't work, then I'll start purchasing amps or break down and finally get a couple of subs.
But very realistically here for Brandon, there might be a little bit of, the signal might actually be clipping. The Denon, the Marantzes are very good in that they have a soft clip circuit, but you would be hearing that distortion at the top end. There would be that soft clipping circuit being engaged, which could give you that harsher, this is screeching at me now type of sound, and having the proper amplifier power for those speakers, because they can handle it. Both of the speakers he's talking about can handle 400 watt peaks very easily. This is a case where an external amp is the solution.
Get you a big hoss of an amp. So finally, now we reach the part of the show where we reach new questions for this week. So after nearly an hour or so, we're beginning the show.
We're caught up.
So this is the beginning of the show, everyone. Welcome to AVRant, where we answer your questions about audio and video. New question. Kris B. Kris just got a JVC NX7 projector. He had an Epson 6040UB before with a 40-foot long HDMI cable. Everything worked fine before. But now, with his new JVC, his Oppo 203 Ultra HD Blu-ray player isn't showing any image. All of his other sources show an image. Could this just be a lack of HDMI bandwidth? Could we recommend a 40-foot long HDMI cable that will pass the full bandwidth? And yes, we can.
Yes to both, in fact. This very much could just be the HDMI cable bandwidth. In fact, did a little bit of back and forth with him before we started recording this podcast. And so first of all, I suggested, he's using an Oppo where you can absolutely tell it output 420 chroma instead of 444. Because by default, if it detects that your display, in his case, the JVC, is capable of accepting 444 chroma, then that's what it'll send. And the JVC can accept that signal. So that's what the Oppo would be setting if it's set to auto. It will send 12-bit if the display says, I can take a 12-bit signal. It'll send 12-bit. You will want to manually set it to 10-bit so that the Oppo is not setting more than 10-bit. Now, I said try those and see if you can still send 60 frames per second, but at 420 and 10-bit. I don't actually know if Kris did that because he wrote back to say, well, changing it to 24 hertz output instead of 60 or auto, that worked. The image showed up on his NX7. His Oppo was outputting 24 hertz, and now the image showed up.
So it is, does that mean it is a bandwidth
problem? So it's
problem?
the cable. Yeah, it's the HDMI cable, which is not shocking. He probably had a high-speed 40-foot HDMI cable, but high speed might have been limited to 10.2 gigabits per second, which would not send 4K at 60 hertz with HDR and, 444 and 12-bit certainly. That would put you well over the bandwidth of 10.2 gigabits per second. So the thing is, Ultra HD Blu-rays, there is one Ultra HD Blu-ray out there that uses 60 hertz. All the rest use 24. So Billy Lynn's Long Halftime Walk uses 60 hertz. Every other Ultra HD Blu-ray uses 24. So unless Billy Lynn's Long Halftime Walk is your number one priority, you can probably leave things as is for now.
I want to meet the person for whom it is the number one priority.
And the fact that he said his other sources worked fine suggests to me that just lowering things to 420 and 10-bit, and that might work at 60 hertz. So again, I don't know if Kris tried that in the Oppo. Just doing those things. So if that's the case, why go to the expense and the hassle of replacing the 40-foot cable, right now? Because you can get an image. For sure you can get an image, just lowering the bandwidth limitation. But if you want to, if you're like, yep, I've got to have Billy Lynn's long halftime walk, that's just the way it is, and it's got to be at 60 hertz, well then, over at Monoprice, you can get their dynamic view. That is their active HDMI cable. You can certainly get one of those. And I also like to recommend Blue Jeans cable. It is their Series 3A. That is their active HDMI cable. The Blue Jeans cable costs about $20 more at the 40-foot length than the Monoprice one. I have I've had enough people write to me and I've had enough experience of my own going through that Monoprice, as much as I love them, the cables are inexpensive, and once in a while there can be a little connector problem. That's all it usually is. The connector at the end, you do enough bending of it, you plug it and unplug it enough times, it can come loose after a while. They're so darn cheap that replacing it is like,
get another
cost-wise, very simple to do. But it's the hassle of this 40-foot cable that I'm sure is not just traipsed on the ground in his case, right?
Yeah, exactly.
To me, that's a case where maybe the $20 extra, because Blue Jeans is going to be rock solid. So there you go. Okay. I'll just throw that out there.
Right. So is there an indicator we can look for that'll tell us what can be carried over this cable? What are we looking for again?
They will specify the bandwidth, and you're looking for
Just look for the bandwidth.
You're looking for 18 gigabits per second. You're ideally looking for Ultra HD Premium certified, but even the Blue Jeans one isn't, because they don't certify active cables for Ultra HD Premium. They only certify passive cables for Ultra HD Premium.
But they give you a bandwidth.
But these are the manufacturers, Monoprice and Blue Jeans. They will tell you the bandwidth, and both of them will say on the dynamic view from Monoprice and the Series 3A from Blue Jeans, they will say, yes, these will pass 18 gigabits per second, and enough people have used them that I know that they will.
A little bit more from Kris. He says he's having a difficult time getting the image to perfectly fit his 16:9 screen. It was very easy to get it perfectly lined up with his Epson. So is there something he's missing? Now that question confuses me. How do you not line up an image? That's interesting. What exactly was the nature of his difficulty?
Right, so there's a couple of things going on here, and one that I didn't even think of until today before we started the podcast, so I didn't even tell him this one before, but I'll do the first one first, which is that the Epson and the JVC both have very long zoom ranges and lots of lens shift, both vertically and horizontally, but not the same, and the Epson does have more. So it's possible. I'll just use the example. I don't know if Kris's screen size is actually 120 inches, but just as an example, if it were a 120-inch 16:9 screen, both of them, you could have the lens of the projector anywhere from about 12 to 24 feet away from that 120-inch screen to fully fill the screen zoom-wise. But the Epson does have a little bit more range, so if you're a little bit closer than 12 feet or a little bit farther than 24 feet, it could be the zoom, because the Epson does have a little bit more range than the JVC. The other one is the lens shift, right? If you're talking the Epson, it can lens shift up and down or left and right a bit more than the JVC can, right? So again, on this 120-inch screen, the JVC, essentially the lens starts at the very middle of the screen, and then you could move the whole image about 45 inches up or down, or about 35 inches to the left or right. That's with the JVC. You can't do the maximum of both at the same time. Like, you couldn't move it 45 inches up and 35 inches to the left. The full shape actually forms like an octagon. So if you moved it 45 up, you can only move it a little bit to the left or right.
Gotcha. Okay.
But the Epson, similar thing. You can't do the maximums, but it could go 55 inches up or down versus 45, or 50 inches to the left or right versus 35. So if his projector is mounted very high, or it's moved over to the left or the right, it's possible that he's just outside of the lens shift range of the JVC.
Right. But he didn't say if he was having like a trapezoid problem or what. He didn't describe what he meant by having a difficult time.
So that's why I actually realized it might be this last thing, which is that the JVC is a genuine 4K, not Ultra HD, actual 4K resolution projector, meaning its pixel count is 4096 by 2160, not 3840 by 2160, which is Ultra HD resolution. When we're saying 4K, that's not technically correct. I mean, it's become so common in the language to use 4K and Ultra HD interchangeably that we don't bother explaining that every time, but Ultra HD means 3840 by 2160, and technically 4K means 4096 by 2160. So it is actually wider. It has more pixels width-wise than an actual Ultra HD projector.
Would a perfect match then be a screen that was a touch wider?
Yes, it would be a 17 by 9 screen instead of a 16 by 9.
17 by 9. How about that? Okay, so yeah, so that's like if you're watching Netflix and you're watching it on a 16 by 9 television. This used to blow my mind till I learned of this real 4K resolution, that there'd be a thin little bar at the top and a thin little bar at the bottom. I'm like, what is going on? Is it squishing it? And nothing looked out of proportion, and I just didn't know what was happening because I wasn't aware that there's a 4096 by 2160. And now if you're like, if you're on YouTube, all of the high-end YouTubers like to use that 4096 because it looks
well, also
more
they're getting
professional.
true 4K cameras, and that's just natively what it's shooting at.
There you go.
So
it may be the case if he has a 16 by 9 screen, but his projector is true 4K 17 by 9. I can see maybe that's.
I think if he's just throwing up
the
grid pattern, he's like, this matches the height of my screen perfectly, but it's always a little bit too wide. It's like, yeah, because there actually are more pixels than 16 by 9. That's what's going on there.
So he would have to bring it in. He'd have to get closer to the screen.
What you would want to do is make the height perfect and actually have it overshooting on the left and right a little bit, because all of your sources
for 16 by 9 content.
All of your sources are sending 16 by 9. There are actually little teeny black bars on the left and the right of that JVC all the time.
So there's no way to get those, because all of the, say, YouTube videos where people are using true 4K cameras, those are all still inside a 16 by 9.
Still inside a 16 by 9 frame, putting little teeny black bars at the top and bottom. But so there'd be little teeny black bars at the left and right and little teeny black bars at the top and bottom. But you would just have those little teeny black bars on the left and right projecting onto the frame of your screen. Yeah,
like how infuriating. I don't understand why people. So if you have a 4K camera and you're making YouTube videos or you're making a movie, just cut the sides off of your picture. Just
make it 16 by 9.
Don't put it on me. Don't make it difficult for me and for Kris. That's not fair. All right.
I actually think that's probably what's going on.
All right. Well, check that out, Kris. Moving on to Mike S. Mike's theater is finally at a stage where he can use it for the time being, although he still has some finish work to complete. Man, I know that feeling. I had a house like that. I got a house like that. I finally finished a bathroom after 16 years. It's roughly 20 feet by 13.5 feet by 7.5 feet. The ceiling is lined with a soffit grid, so the taller parts of the ceiling go up to 8.5 feet. All of his lighting, wiring, and any pipes or ducts were kept in the soffits, so he was able to fully soundproof this room. Awesome. And I'm seeing pictures of his room. I don't know if you're able to use OBS to show everyone.
Man, oh man, I'm going to have to come up with a better way for future weeks. But no, there is an image being shown right now so that you can have an idea of what this theater looks like. So very nice looking theater. I can't quite tell. That might be a black paint because of the lighting that we're seeing in the photos. It looks like maybe it's an exceedingly dark gray on the walls. The ceiling looks black, and then the walls look like an exceedingly dark gray. That's just to my eyes, though. But yeah, at the moment,
I think it's all going to be a lighting trick.
We're showing. So he's got lighting installed in these this soffit grid pattern that he's put up on his ceiling there, and so yeah, at the moment, he hasn't got his center speaker stand installed yet, so he's just got it on top of a couple of boxes for the moment. That's what's going on there. And then we also have some images of the back of his room, and I'll see if I can pull those up in a second.
Right. So I will continue on. The next approximately half hour of the show will be just for Mike, apparently. We talked about the seating riser at the back of the room on previous episodes. We recommended lining the bottom with sand to make it inert, but he just couldn't bring himself to carry down all those bags of sand. I agree. I don't think I could do it either. So there's only insulation and air inside. He can feel it resonating with the base a bit, but he doesn't think it's too bad. What if you tried sandbags, like already bagged up?
I guess still heavy, but he was
Still
like,
heavy,
he didn't want to.
I just wouldn't want to bring loose sand and pour it into a thing in a nice room in my house. That's kind of crazy. I don't want to do that. Anyway, he has a pair of SVS SB2000 subwoofers, kind of like we were just talking about. One of them is at the back of the room on top of the riser. Would adding isolation feet help at all? Would there be any value to having isolation feet under the sub at the front of the room as well? The front sub is on the concrete floor that is fully carpeted. It feels to me like there's never a bad thing to try to isolate.
Absolutely.
And certainly on a riser has more chance of vibrating than that concrete floor.
Not really. My answer is yes and yes.
Really?
Yeah,
Okay.
this is one of those things that comes up all the time. People are like, I have a concrete foundation. I don't need isolation from us. Yes, you do. Concrete.
You feel like you wouldn't.
Concrete will absolutely vibrate in sympathy with a physically moving thing that is right on top of it. We've all seen that crazy video of that bridge that got caught in the wind.
Oh, yeah.
That was a concrete bridge.
Oh, what was that bridge?
And
I used to know the name of that bridge.
It was waving and moving. That's concrete. Concrete is not completely solid and stiff. It will absolutely move, and it will absolutely vibrate in sympathy with a subwoofer that is sitting directly on top of it. So yes and yes, absolutely get isolation feet for both. Will it completely remove all resonant vibrating of that riser? No, it won't, but it will reduce it.
Yeah. Right. Okay, so he has some more questions. Some of the remaining projects are the following. All of the trim work, which will be the very last thing done, mounting his projector to the ceiling, so ignore the temporary furniture in the pictures at the back that he's using. Finishing the shelving in the niche on the right side where he'll keep a few source devices, most of his gear's in a separate room. Making a stand for his center speaker. So again, ignore the temporary boxes. Yeah, I've had temporary boxes in this home office studio for, a decade and a half. I understand. And the big one is adding room treatments and finishing the installation of his side surround speakers. So as far as acoustic treatments go, where does he begin? Even with the fully carpeted floor and the riser with the insulation inside it, he still has obvious reverberation and slap echo. It's bad enough that he wasn't super impressed with his SVS Prime center at first, but he quickly realized it's mostly the room's acoustics. What's giving him some pause is that he doesn't want to lose a ton of room width. He's already thinking that he'd like to recess his side surround speakers, and he has a plan in mind for making soundproof backer boxes. But should he make custom acoustic panels that have an opening for the surround speakers and then have absorption all around them? Should he completely conceal the niche on the right side with a panel on a hinge? Does he need panels on his ceiling? Whew, that's a lot of questions about room treatments. To me, the first thing you always go for are those first reflection points on the sides.
Yeah, I mean...
To me,
my honest answer is you almost so first of all, in the overall sense, you generally you add up all the surface area of your room, so your four walls and your ceiling and floor, you get all of that surface area, and then you want about 1/3 of that, about 30% of that to be covered in something absorptive. Carpet over a pad counts, so very often if you can carpet the floor, that's a huge help because that's a large amount of surface area, but it's still not 1/3 of the room. It's still not 30%. Now for me, I almost always want the back wall before everything else.
Oh, yeah? Okay.
To me, the back wall is even more important than the first reflections on the side wall. But chances are, if you're aiming for 30%, you're going to end up with both. And see, he can certainly do both in this room. He can put put panels on his back wall. He can put panels on his side walls. Now, we are usually talking about the first reflection points to begin with. So that's pretty much the whole back wall, whatever you can do on that back wall. And it doesn't, in a theater like this, it doesn't necessarily have to be pre-made panels or even DIY panels. You could actually just put insulation right on the walls and cover the walls in fabric directly. And that's it.
Yeah.
You don't necessarily have to make individual panels that you hang. You can,
although that could get kind of lumpy. You need something
possibly.
to
it's nice to have but we know he can do framework. With that's that we know he can do. So, you make yourself a little bit of a frame structure for that insulation to sit in. Maybe even the framing is deep enough that you can have a little bit of air gap behind that insulation, and then you just cover over that framing you made with fabric, and there you go. You've covered a large amount of surface area quickly and easily and inexpensively.
And also, he's worried about losing the width of the room. To me, I mean, granted, if you make perfect sound absorption panels, they're pretty deep.
Yeah,
right?
well,
Like
it depends on what frequencies.
I don't find that necessary. I've had such good luck with like a cheap old bedspread that I can't imagine, for getting rid of like slap echo and a lot of those high frequency things that affect voices.
I mean, the thinner your treatment is, the higher in frequency it will be effective at, or the other way to say it is that the less effective it will be at lower frequencies, the thinner your treatments are. So if you almost kind of want to get some measurement here, although it's going to be tough if you're literally getting an echo right now. But you kind of want to look at some waterfall graphs and see, because if you have pretty long decay times happening at, say, 125 hertz or 100 hertz or something like that, which is not at all uncommon, but if that's what you're getting, well, then you need some pretty thick absorption to be effective at that. So let's see, if you take say a 4 or 6 inch thick piece of insulation and straddle that across a corner so that you have a large amount of air behind that 4 or 6 thick inch insulation, that's the stuff that'll get you down to maybe 80 to 100 hertz. That's the type of thickness you need to get down that low. A panel that is about 6 inches thick, that could be 4 inches with an air gap or just 6 inches of insulation. Something that thick will be effective down to about 125 hertz. So you're talking about 6 inches. Now that could definitely be, say, your back wall. It could also, he asked about should he be putting anything on his ceiling. It could be in those cavities in your ceiling.
Yeah.
That could be a very effective place to put some 6 inch thick insulation. Now this is all dependent on, do you have some long decay times at 125 hertz? Because if all of your echoing in that is taking place above 125 hertz, go up an octave. Is it starting at 250 hertz? Well, now you can get away with a panel that's about 4 inches thick instead of 6 inches. That could be 2 inches thick with a 2 inch air gap or 4 inch thick insulation. But now it's effective to about 250 hertz. 2 inch panels, which are very common, but 2 inch panels really aren't effective anywhere below about 500 hertz. So
I'm thinking he's got those big gaps, well, not gaps, he's got those recesses in the ceiling. That looks like a perfect place to go for those thicker absorption situations.
If that's what's happening.
I don't think he's going to want to cover up all his beautifully painted walls. So that's when you go with long strips of DIY panels, in my opinion, along those walls.
I certainly would treat your first reflection points on the fronts of the side walls. I absolutely would do that. But those, we are talking generally the mid-range, so probably 4 inches thick at most. And 2 inch thick panels can probably do well there.
Probably.
So, it wouldn't hurt you to get some waterfall graphs, see where you are getting those longer decay times. The lower it is, the thicker the panels you'll need, and probably the easiest place to put the thicker panels would be in the ceiling.
All right, here comes some more questions from him. He put his towers to either side of his screen. He had pre-wired for this subwoofers to go in the front right corner and rear left corner. But even with the smaller SB2000 subs, it's a tight squeeze up front, too tight. He can't tow in his front right tower the way he would like. And he wired separate zones of lighting with the hope that he could maybe have a bit of light on for certain content instead of the room always being completely pitch black. But with any lights at all, he gets a shadow from his front speakers on the screen. So, would it be wise to put his subs at the midpoints of the front wall and back wall instead? He needs a stand for his center speaker anyway, so he was thinking of building one that would allow the front SB2000 to sit underneath. Then he could spread his front towers a bit wider. Does all that sound good? Initially in my head, that sounds like an interesting idea.
That all sounds great to me. You'll have the minor inconvenience of a slightly longer subwoofer cable that'll go from the outlet that you already pre-wired in the corner. But how much are you honestly going to... You can tuck that into the baseboard behind the carpet, right?
Yeah, you can hide that.
And... absolutely. The SB2000 is certainly small enough. We can see it in the front corner of the photo that the height that we can already eyeball it, the height that the center speaker is at on the couple of boxes he's temporarily using, that's tall enough that the SB2000 could certainly sit under there. Middle of the front wall, middle of the back wall placement is ideal. So, Yep. 100% in favor of that.
There's a big yes on that. Absolutely. Also, he's using a Denon X6400H receiver. And he's currently using its 11 built-in amps to power all 11 of his speakers. His primary seat is 11 feet from his 120-inch screen up front. I hope 11's his lucky number, by the way. So he's 11 feet from his 120-inch screen up front, and he's using SVS Prime speakers up front with Focal Superbird surrounds. Does he have a reason to power some of his speakers with external amplification? Only if you're having shutdowns like me.
Yeah, honestly, with the distances that you've listed and the speakers that you're using, so mathematically, you are right on the borderline. Realistically, you almost certainly do not need an external amplifier. In realistic, I'm actually using it in the real world terms. You almost certainly don't. But mathematically speaking, you're right on the borderline. So if this is a case of you want one and you need to justify it to yourself, you don't have to go nuts. You don't. I mean, I love monoprice monolith amplifiers, but you don't need one. Again, an Outlaw Model 5000 that can genuinely output continuously 120 watts to all 5 channels all at the same time continuously is well more than enough.
By the way, side note for me, if I buy amp and power my woofers with a separate amp on my Yamaha receiver, would that help my shutting down at high volume problem?
Yes, but as we talked about last week, you'd want to make sure you get an external amp that has adjustable gain, because
I meant if I can use 2 amps in my, I can take the little thing off the back of my speaker, 2 amps from my AV receiver. Because it's just the one power supply.
It is. Yeah, that's a little more questionable. I mean, technically, there you can have a bit more. Let's see. So, I mean, the output transistors of each individual channel of each amplifier wouldn't get saturated, but you're ultimately still limited to the same maximum power supply power. So, if what you're talking about, you probably want to hook up an external amp, but you'd want to make sure it's one that has adjustable gain so that you don't end up with the gain being different between the treble and the bass.
Right. Anyway, side note for myself, sorry. Moving on to Dan C. Dan's got his TV, a cable box, and a couple of game systems. He would like some basic battery backup protection so that his cable box doesn't have to reset and his game progress won't be lost if there's a short power outage. What's the most cost-effective UPS we'd recommend to him? Yeah, my experience with battery backups is only in the computer world.
Sure. I mean, for that reason, my very favorite one, and I'll mention it first, my very favorite one to recommend is APC's J25B. That is definitely my very favorite battery backup to recommend, but it costs about $250, and size-wise, it's the size of like a regular component. Like take one of those Marantz Slimline receivers. It's kind of about that size and about that weight because it's a big old lead acid battery in there, so it is not light.
Yeah.
On the back of it,
it
has 8 outlets. They're nicely spaced. 6 of them are connected to the battery, and the 2 that are labeled as surge only, those are high current outlets that will let through the full 15 amps. They don't choke down the amperage at all, so that's a great place to plug in your subwoofer or your amplifier, your AV receiver, because it won't choke that down at all. So those high current outlets don't provide battery backup, but they do provide the full 15 amps. But what he's describing, that's probably overkill. And $250 is probably more than he wants to spend, and it's probably more expensive.
That's a lot,
than he really wants to go for. So again, I'm sticking with APC. This is in their back UPS lineup, and it would be the BE850. That's the model I recommend to you. It goes for about $90. Over at BH Photo, it's $87. I don't think that's unreasonable. I should mention
no, it's not.
The J25. If the only thing you had plugged into that was say your cable DVR, most of those use about 60 watts, and it could power that for definitely an hour. On a good day, an hour and a half. So between an hour and a half, the J25 could keep your DVR running if that was the only thing plugged in. Now the BE850, you're looking at half an hour for sure, maybe 45 minutes on a good day. So, about half the battery runtime. But that's, I mean, if you're talking a short power outage, or you just want to unplug everything, move something around and plug it back in, definitely good enough for that. And good enough that you could continue playing your game for enough to just save it, and shut everything down safely. So I can recommend that line. I've had an APC UPS give its life to save my computer,
and a couple of other objects.
And definitely better
never had a problem with
$90 than
one.
whatever you've got plugged in, right?
Yeah, because I've got a lot more than $90
That's
plugged
right.
in.
So, it's a nice size. It's a little bigger than you might expect because, again, still a lead acid battery inside of that thing. But no, it's got 9 outlets, 6 of which are connected to the battery, 3 of which are not. But its surge-only outlets are not high current. They do clamp it down to 12 amps, not the full 15 coming out of your outlet. But for the things he described, none of them are using that kind of power.
Plugging in a giant piece of equipment.
Not a huge amplifier, not a subwoofer yet. So
you're doing like woodworking with really big, big power. My headphone is doing something weird.
I don't know.
Oh man,
Might be
what's
something
happening?
to do with all of our craziness with Skype and OBS. Who knows?
The world is weird this week. That's for
Yup.
sure. I may just have to take that headphone out of my ear. Let's just go this way, and I
you
can still hear
me
you
in one ear.
I can hear you halfway. It's time for an Infinite Gary
It had
question.
to be there. You're here, Lee. It had to be there.
I'm here, therefore there must be an Infinite Gary question. What's the correct gamma target? 2.2 or 2.4? It's 2.2.
Well.
What? Wait, what? No? What's the correct gamma target? 2.2 or 2.4? What?
The real correct answer is neither, because the real correct answer now is BT 1886. There's a fully ratified gamma for standard dynamic range, which is now...
Does it have a translation into these numbers? Does it come out as a 2 point something?
It's closest to 2.4.
Really?
Between the two gamma curves, it's closest to 2.4. But that is for movies in a very dark setting. Okay, that's what it's for.
Because I've spent all these years learning to calibrate to 2.2.
Because 2.2 is what you use when you have some ambient light. It's what most television programs are mastered to.
Right.
So the answer is it could be both. Technically neither, because BT 1886 is the official standard now. But it really kind of depends. If you're in a dark room watching a movie, 2.4 is usually the correct target if you are using gamma. If you're in a room with some ambient light watching television, it's probably 2.2, which is why it does make sense on a television to have both a bright setting and a dark setting, if you want to think of it that way. And I would usually recommend your bright setting, picture mode, whatever that might be. That might be ISF bright. It has a gamma of 2.2, and the ISF dark has a gamma of 2.4 or BT 1886.
How about that? On my LG OLED, I preferred the bright
sure.
ISF.
It lightens everything up a little bit.
And I mean, and I don't know. I turn all the lights off sometimes, and I still like it like that.
Nothing wrong with that.
But that's just me. So, moving on with Infinite Gary's information and questions. His older LG OLED, on which he often watches baseball games, was calibrated for 2.2 by the professional calibrator he hired at the time. Since then, Gary has fiddled with the picture settings many times. Of course he did, because he's Infinite Gary. Many times he's fiddled with it. But he hadn't adjusted the gamma. Gary started reading up on it and found quite a few people advocating for a 2.4 gamma target. So he gave it a try, and he largely preferred the slightly darker looking image. So now he wants to tweak the image some more. Of course, he just wants thoughts on what we think about his tweaking. Dude, if you like it, then you like it.
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, 2.4, like we say, I mean, Gary, we know from my experience talking to him, he tends to like lower peak nits. Lower gamma overall. That's just what his eyes prefer. There ain't nothing wrong with that. And 2.4, like I say, I mean, for movies in a dark room, it is the correct target. And I don't blame the professional calibrator for saying, well, I think the one he's talking about is the OLED that he has in his kitchen, which is almost...
He has an OLED in his kitchen?
Which is almost certainly never completely pitch black. I mean, the walls are not pitch black. It's a white kitchen, like most kitchens are light colored anyway, right? And he's saying, I'm watching sports on this. I've got lights on, and the professional calibrator, of course, would just assume, I'm going to calibrate this to 2.2. That's almost certainly what
Makes
you
sense.
would do.
Yeah.
So I don't blame anybody in this, but Gary, absolutely. If you find 2.4 preferable to your eyes, absolutely. And there is no... Technically, it depends on the content and the environment. Yeah, so.
Right. So, the thought is, it's not like you're crazy, man. That if it looks good to you, it looks good to you. And apparently, you're right for certain things. Yes. Darkroom movies. He's got displays that he's never felt the need to tweak after they were calibrated. I can't believe that. And other displays that he's tweaking all the time. I can believe that. They've all been professionally calibrated at some point. So why don't the results look consistent? Oh, man.
Environment and content.
Yes, environment content.
Largely
Yeah,
environment
yeah.
content. And it can also be, I mean, he does have varying displays, LCD, OLED, projector,
Right.
which don't all have the same contrast. And our
No,
eye,
you can't get the character of those to be
our
the
eye
same.
picks up contrast more than anything else. More than anything else, our eye
Yeah,
picks up contrast. And so an image that technically has lower nits but higher contrast, our brain
Right.
might perceive as being brighter.
Or just more realistic.
It could be that. It could be a number of things.
To my
right?
eye.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
the professional calibrator is getting your display as close to the industry standard targets as they can. That doesn't mean that display can reach those targets. It doesn't mean it can hit
Right.
those targets. And you are in different environments in different rooms. Some have more lighting. Some have different colored walls. So the light, the photons that are reaching the sensors in your eyes are differing depending on the environment. And you're watching different types of displays with different content. So things are not going to look consistent. You've got a large number of variables. And unless all the variables
That's right.
were the same, you can't expect the display to look identical from room to room, content to content, display to display.
See, it's like timbre, but for screens. So in one of Gary's setups, he's using a Sony A8F OLED, that must be in the bathroom, with a Marantz SR6011 and an Oppo 203 Ultra HD Blu-ray player. He's noticed that if he's watching an HDR10 disc, he can press the info or sound mode button on his Marantz remote, and the graphics from the Marantz will show up on screen on top of the video just like they do when he's watching TV. But if he's watching a Dolby Vision disc, there's a momentary dropout of the video and or audio signal, and the Marantz graphics never show up on top of the video. It's either a black screen and then the Marantz graphics by themselves, or just no graphics at all if he's just adjusting the sound mode. Is that because of Dolby Vision somehow? That stands to reason. Is it maybe different from disc to disc, or is it just a Marantz thing and other brands of AV receivers would show the graphics on top of Dolby Vision signals? What's different about Dolby Vision versus HDR10 since the graphics show up over HDR10 signals?
Yeah, so I can't for certain tell you that there is no AV receiver out there that will overlay graphics on top of Dolby Vision. There might be. I am just not aware of any. What I'm aware of is that all AV receivers that pass through Dolby Vision signals will not overlay graphics, and that seems to be a requirement of Dolby Vision. We had AV receivers that came out that were later firmware upgraded to support Dolby Vision pass-through. When they first came out, they couldn't pass through a Dolby Vision signal at all, and then they later got a firmware update that allowed them to pass through a Dolby Vision signal, and the requirement to do that is that the AV receiver doesn't touch the video signal. Dolby's like, no, this is Dolby Vision. The display needs to sync up with the source. You are just a device passing it through, and you do not get to touch the Dolby Vision video signal AV receiver in the middle of this signal chain. That seems to be the way things are, and that that means the video processing inside the Marantz, the overlay graphics being a part of that, are just shut out of the signal, and they can't be overlaid on there. Whereas HDR10, it's a simpler signal. There's no varying metadata. There's no overseeing body like Dolby demanding that this is the way it's done. So like, yeah, go ahead and mess with the signal with the video processing that's built into the AV receiver. It doesn't have to be shut off for HDR10.
He has more questions. More question. Within the Oppo 203's setup menus under the HDR section, there are options to set the output to auto, player LED, or display LED. Which should he use?
Auto should be fine.
Yeah.
But you are using a Sony OLED, and the Sony OLEDs, the only option, there are the three options, auto, player LED, or display LED, and the only option that would not work is display LED. It would have to either be player LED, but auto should work fine. Now, we know...
Why would display LED not work?
So display LED is the original version of Dolby Vision, which is that the signal just came out of the player, it was all sent to the display, and the display did all of the number crunching. The Sony TVs, when they first came on board, didn't have the processing power to do that, so the number crunching had to be done inside of the player, and that is what necessitated all of the early Ultra HD Blu-ray players to get their own firmware updates to support Dolby Vision output to Sony Dolby Vision TVs. It was a whole thing that had to be done. So yeah, you got two good options, auto or player LED.
There you go. Moving on to another questioner, Stefan B in Barbados. The B does not necessarily stand for Barbados. That would be an interesting last name named after a country. Stefan B in Barbados first wanted to say thanks for discussing his projector and subwoofer questions last week. Awesome, no problem. I will speak for Tom on his behalf. Since he said he was looking to add 2 more subwoofers to his existing pair of SVS SP-2000s, we asked if this was mostly about wanting better uniformity or whether he just wanted stronger, louder bass. And of course, we also asked about his room size. And when I say we, I mean Tom and Rob. He says his room is roughly 15.5 by 16.5 feet. He likes to have several friends over, particularly to watch sports. And with his room being close to a square, he isn't getting great sounding bass at every seat. Some are obviously quieter. So he thought adding a couple of larger subs to his existing pair might help. So any new thoughts in light of that information? Uniformity is the big reason you get more subs rather than different larger subs.
Absolutely. Just get 2 more of the SB2000s, and if you want more bass, your room size is not so loud. Like if you're just like, I calibrated everything to where it's supposed to be, but I just want some more bass, you just turn them up a little bit.
Just notch it up
because
man. It's
you
okay.
aren't running into the output limits of your SB2000s. They have more headroom. They can play louder. That if you've perfectly calibrated this, even at full reference volume, they still have headroom to spare. So output isn't your issue. The seats that are sounding quieter than the others, that's because of sound wave interactions. And yes, in a room that is almost perfectly square, you get more than in a, we talk about a rectangle using prime numbers so that there aren't evenly divisible dimensions, right? But you're talking one that's almost a square. So you're getting a lot more waves piling up on top of each other and interacting. So yeah, that all makes sense. If you added 2 more SB2000.
Does a golden ratio triangle,
it works darn well.
Rectangle make a difference? A golden ratio rectangle?
Darn well.
Yeah.
Yes.
I bet it does, just because that's what the universe likes. He'll get the Epson 5050 UB, and he wants a 120-inch screen, but when his friends are over to watch sports, they'll have some lights on for sure. The room definitely won't be pitch black. He'd still like it to look good, so he was considering an ambient light rejecting screen, mainly looking at what Elite Screens has to offer. They list Cinegray, Cinegray 3D, and Cinegray 5D. What are the differences, and what would we recommend? Well, see, it's the number of Ds.
Yeah, it's the 3D one does make things confusing, but those are just different gains. The regular Cinegray is a 1.0 gain screen. The 3D is a 1. I think they actually listed a 1.2. It would make more sense if it were 1.3 because the Cinegray 5D is a 1.5 gain screen. So they're just increasing amount of gain. Gain means that if you're projecting the image from the projector straight on, that if you are also sitting straight on, you get the most light reflecting back to you. But as soon as you move off axis to the left or right, it drops off in the amount of light being reflected back to you significantly. And
yeah, see, that's a pet peeve of mine with any display. I hate it when things drop off to the sides.
And higher,
because people are sitting beside each other, not in front of each other.
Higher gain
no
also
one lines up in a line to watch football.
It also tends to result in hot spotting the higher the gain, because you get that brighter glow right in the middle of the screen versus the edges of the screen that look dimmer when you have a high gain. So for this, if you were to stick with the Elite lineup, I would certainly go, in your case, with the Cinegray 3D, not the 5D, not the regular Cinegray. I would go with the 3D in your case. You want some gain, but not really high gain, and the 1.0 wouldn't help you very much at all. That's just a gray screen. I'm not a tremendous fan of the just overall gray screens. The Cinegray 3D is decent. I'm pretty okay with that, and the price can't be beat. So my favorite of ambient light rejecting screens is LunaVision's. They have their Aurora ambient light rejecting screen, but we're talking the difference between the Elite Cinegray 3D with, I think he was going for the very thin bezel. The very thin frame screen is the one he was looking at. And that goes for, I think, between $650, $750 for the 120-inch size. It's that type of price range anyway. Whereas the Aurora is into the thousands. It's into the thousands of dollars. Probably
that's a lot.
It's probably about $2,200 for the 120.
Yeah, and since he's already going to buy 2 more subs.
So, I mean, as much as I prefer the LunaVision, it is a considerably more advanced screen. It's got multiple layers and uses little beaded technology and reflectors and suppressors and all kinds of fancy stuff on the screen. And the price can be justified, but it's a lot more money. And
yeah, Stefan did not mention a budget.
Well, yeah, but I mean,
a lot is a lot.
He's going for the
anyone.
50-50, not some $20,000 projector.
Right. So that kind of
I mean, the Cinegray 3D, I can get behind that. You're probably going to end up putting the 50-50 into high lamp mode when you have people over watching sports. That's almost certainly fine. It's got lots of light output. It can overcome the ambient light. The gray screen helps a little bit. The little bit of gain helps a little bit. So, and it doesn't look too bad in the dark. It's a little bit of a compromise on both ends.
It's a good balance.
Yep.
On each of those situations.
But I can get behind that one because the price makes so much more sense. If you've got the money to spend, then please have a look at the Illuna Vision. It is my favorite of the ambient light rejecting screens, but it's a lot more money.
There you go. Moving on to another questioner whose name, I apologize ahead of time if I don't say it right, but Sushmit?
I think so.
On Twitter?
Yeah, that's what we've been saying.
Sushmit?
He'll know it's him.
Sounds right. He'll know. Sushmit added a couple of 2-inch thick absorption panels on his side walls. He didn't notice much, if any, difference. So he took some measurements with Room EQ Wizard, but just looking at the frequency response and other graphs, it wasn't clear to him what difference those panels might be making. So, on Rob's request, he sent some impulse response graphs. And after some discussion, he added two more 2-inch thick panels to his sidewalls closer to his front speakers. No panels versus one panel on each sidewall. We've got an impulse response graph for that. And then we'll have a similar graph for one panel on each side wall versus 2 panels on each sidewall.
Yes. So in this first one, I mean, it might be a little bit hard to make out in the video or in the image because unfortunately the way Room EQ Wizard...
Especially hard to make out on the audio-only podcast.
Yes. But we're looking at an impulse response graph. So at the very beginning of this graph is the impulse that was sent out, the chirp tone that was sent out. And then we're seeing in milliseconds the response after that, and we can see right around 3 milliseconds there's a fairly strong secondary little blip in there, and then just before about 9 milliseconds we're seing another one that's fairly strong. But it's a little bit hard to make out because of the colors, but the blue one, these are overlaid, there's a blue graph, that is when he had the one absorption panel on each side wall versus the purple or magenta graph in behind it, which is when he had no absorption whatsoever. And we can see at the 8 or 9 millisecond mark that with none at all, the purple is extending much higher and lower than the blue.
Yeah, it did help with that.
So that is some reflection off of that sidewall that is being curtailed by those single panels. Now, if we switch over to the image where he went from 1 panel to 2 panels, we can see a big difference at that 3 millisecond mark.
Really helped that one, yeah.
Now, when he first said, I have this one at 3 milliseconds and then this another one at 8 or 9 milliseconds, I initially thought maybe it's the front wall. It's the wall behind the front speakers, because there is a wave that's going backward to the front wall and then coming at you, and that usually is only about 2 or 3 milliseconds behind the initial, because, if the speakers are 1.5 feet away from the front wall, then it'll be 3 milliseconds as it went to the front wall and back. So I was initially thinking that, but since he put these additional sidewall panels up, that is almost certainly the 3 millisecond one is probably the actual first reflection. It's that little bit of extra distance of going from the speaker to the sidewall to your ear instead of straight from the speaker to your ear. And then that 10 millisecond one was maybe a second. Like, there are first reflections and there are second reflections and there are third reflections. So it bounced off of one wall, went across the room, bounced off the other wall and made it to your ear. There's your secondary reflection. It's like a billiard ball bouncing around a pool table, right? So that 10 millisecond one could easily be speaker to the opposite side wall and then to your ear, something like that.
I think you're probably right, because that also, when you put the second panel up, it reduced that second echo at
even further.
8 milliseconds, even a little more.
So the thing is,
and that's why I'm such a fan of those reflection point absorption panels on the side.
That's right. So I mean, interestingly, we can see more than he can hear that those panels are doing exactly what we want them to do, which is reducing sidewall reflections so that the ratio of direct sound to reflected sound that is reaching your ear is higher. You are now, with those sidewall panels, we can observe it in the graphs, getting more direct sound, that very first impulse, versus the reflected sound. The reflected sound has been reduced. So it's doing what it's supposed to do, but you're not completely hearing it, which can totally be the case, and let's get into that.
All right, so he could see the differences in the impulse response graphs that we're talking about, but he still wasn't hearing them. Sushmit suspected that his biggest problems are in his bass. He uses front speakers with deep bass output capabilities and a single SVS PC-4000 subwoofer. He had previously discovered via measurements and listening that if he sets his front left-right speakers to large, but still sets an 80 hertz crossover frequency and then sets the output of his receiver to LFE plus mains, that he gets more uniform and linear bass response than having the front speaker set to small and only the PC-2000 handling the deep bass. He also measured what his front, left, right speakers output all on their own when they're set to large, no subwoofer. And he has sent those graphs in the form of what looks like fractal mountain landscapes.
So these are your waterfall graphs. These are showing. So if you look at just the top of this line going from left to right, that is the frequency response. And then it looks sort of like mountains coming toward us. That is in the time domain.
So that's time coming forward towards you?
So coming forward toward us, that is time. And so we are sort of seeing the response across time, and that is showing the decay of this sound. How quickly is that initial sound? So it just plays a sweep, very quick little sweep is what the test tone comes out. And then we're seeing how long does it take for that sound to dissipate. So I actually want to start up at the top of this frequency response to begin with. These are what we're looking at, if you're seeing the YouTube video, is just the speakers. They're set to large. There is no subwoofer in here. So we're noticing that in the mid-range, right, between 250 up to around 1.5 kilohertz, right, in that mid-range there, really nice low decay times, right? This graph comes out to
drops off
500
quick.
milliseconds, but really nice low decay times. That's exactly what we want. And I did notice that he had a couple of other charts that we looked through when we were going through this, and there's a little bit of, so I mean, this is not a perfectly flat line in his frequency response. But in the range between about 125 to about 250 hertz, when he had the panels versus not having the panels, the frequency response for those couple of little blips that we're seeing in about 125 to 250 hertz in the first graph there, those were evened out a little bit. And that is probably those side panels having a little bit of effect in there, but they're mostly affecting the range from about 500 hertz up to about 5 kilohertz. But we're seeing up in the upper region here a little bit longer decay time in the treble, around 4 kilohertz or so. Right? Now that is where diffusion would be very effective. If you want to reduce the decay times in your treble even a little bit more, you could be adding diffusion. So that's just a side note that I wanted to make. But it is clear that if he's just playing his front speakers as large, yes, it is the bass where you're having far more issues.
Keeps going.
Right?
Yes. Keeps going. What I don't understand as I look at these waterfall graphs is why when we go from no sub to adding a sub in, there's so much more dramatic ups and downs in that top frequency response.
So let's get into that a little bit. I'll put up an image here, which is...
And it's also a different overall decibel measurement.
Yeah. So this was a different measurement taken at a different time. It's shown a little differently, so it's not apples to apples in the comparison. But the graph that, if you're watching YouTube, now we're looking at the front speakers. So that was the one set to small. Let's get the one where the front speakers have been set to large, and this is with the subwoofer on.
With the sub
all right. So if we go back to just the speakers by themselves, there's a big old dip at about 30 hertz. There's a big old hump at about 45 hertz, and then a small dip maybe around 80 hertz. That's kind of what we're looking at when it's just the speakers by themselves set to full range. Now, leaving the speakers set to full range, but adding in a subwoofer, now the dip at 30 hertz is gone, but strangely, the output at 20 hertz got lower. So it probably means the room is probably ringing a bit down at 20 hertz, and this is evening that out. Now, he's still got a bit of a hump up at 40, 45 hertz, but not as much. But then there's this huge drop off right at the crossover frequency at 80, which isn't there with the speakers by themselves. He doesn't have this. He has a little bit of a dip at 80 with the speakers by themselves, but not this huge drop off that he gets with the subwoofer and the speaker set to large. Big old interaction.
So you're dramatically seeing that crossover frequency.
Right. Now, if he sets the front speakers to small, as we're always advocating for, and has the subwoofer active, suddenly he's got that dip at 30 hertz back again. And overall, the response looks kind of similar to when he just doesn't have a subwoofer whatsoever. Right? All right. So interesting interaction that's going on here. It indicates that actually if he were to possibly lower his crossover frequency, that might work nicely, because instead of having the subwoofer playing all the way up to 80 hertz and a little above, and it obviously interacting with his front large speakers and creating this huge notch at 80 hertz, that since he's not getting that response from just the speakers by themselves, he could try a lower crossover frequency in his case with his particular setup. Now,
So 60 maybe, you mean?
Yeah, maybe try 60, something like that. That's a good candidate. Now, the thing is, he's basically asking if he should return his 2-inch panels on the sidewalls in favor of getting bass traps, because he could take the money that he spent on the 2-inch thick panels and put it towards bass traps instead. Now, as we talked about earlier, bass traps, even if they're thick and straddling your corners, are really not going to help you below 80 hertz. Below 80 hertz, the only way to address that stuff is multiple subwoofers. It really is. Yeah. Now, you've got these speakers that are pretty decent at playing full range. You're combining them with a subwoofer. And when you do, you're getting pretty decent response down at 20, 30, 40 hertz. That's all working well. So it's almost as though you're using the front speakers as your second sub, quote unquote.
Yeah.
The issue, though, is that if there's ever a signal that's requesting low bass out of just one of your front speakers, you're not going to get that response, because now it's just the one speaker playing, not both front speakers playing. So it's a little bit tricky. This is why we prefer the predictability of just dedicated dual or 3 or 4 subwoofers as opposed to setting your speakers to large. But overall, this is not a terrible solution. You could probably try a lower crossover frequency, continuing to set your front speakers to large. And that'll hopefully sort out your stuff. You're keeping the response you more or less have from 20 to about 40 hertz, and then hopefully getting rid of that notch at 80 hertz. But would bass traps, passive bass traps, absorption panels help you below 80 hertz? No, they aren't going to do a darn thing. Now, we did.
So that's his next question, by the way. So you're answering it right there.
So we did see a little bit going on, a little bit of extra sound resonance happening in that 125 hertz range. And that's where some thicker panels could potentially help. But actually, if you notice, when it's just the speakers playing, on their own, we're seeing that there's still some residual sound happening out to 500 milliseconds, but it's way, way quieter. The actual drop off there at like 100 hertz is still pretty darn fast. It's still quite even with what's happening up at 200, 300, 400 hertz. And maybe there's literally just something kind of rattling at 100 and 125 hertz. That could be that.
I definitely get rattles when I shut down my amplifier recently watching Apollo 11. I get I got windows that go nuts. So, and I don't know what to do about
my
it.
genuine answer to you, Sushmit, is that bass traps aren't going to help what is most ailing your room, which is 80 hertz and lower. The only solution there is multiple subs. And your panels on the sidewalls are doing what they should be doing. We've seen that in the measurements, but it's probably being masked by your bass problems. That's probably why you're not noticing it. If all your bass were sorted out, maybe you'd hear that subtle difference that's being made by the sidewall panels, but it's probably being masked right now. You could benefit from some diffusion, and he was actually saying maybe he'll get some little bit thicker panels that have the scatter plate on top.
Okay.
Killing 2 birds with 1 stone. I'm totally in favor of that, because you do have this little bit going on at 125 hertz where some thicker panels could help you, and then you could benefit from some diffusion according to these measurements. So that's a good solution if you're getting a couple more panels. But I wouldn't necessarily do away with your sidewall panels, because they're doing what they should be doing. They're probably just being masked by something else.
Right, don't take them out. Yeah. But boy, I tell you what, these waterfall graphs looks like something I need to learn a lot more about. There's a lot going on, a lot of information in these.
Frequency and time. It's very handy.
Yeah, that's really interesting. All right, we're going to move on to Ryan T, and then I think we'll have time for Ryan and maybe Brandon. Okay. All right, so Ryan had to put his theater build on hold for a little while, but now he's ready to move forward again. All along, he had intended to go with Ascend CMT 340 SE speakers as his front 3. His room is 11 feet by 26 feet by 7 feet, enclosed, and he'll have a false wall up front, so the speakers will be hidden behind his projection screen. He wants the sound to be detailed and effortless, and that's the way I'm reading that in quotes, detailed and effortless. And now he's wondering if the JBL Stage Series speakers might be an even better choice. What do we think? For me, when somebody says detailed and effortless, I think of just really accurate speakers handling a lot of power.
Which is exactly what the CMT 340s can do.
Right.
So I mean, the only JBL Stage Series speakers that I've heard in person are the largest towers, the A190s. I found them bass heavy. I thought they were...
Well, they're JBLs.
They are JBLs. There is nothing super shocking about that. They are a little bit more efficient. I do like the waveguide that's on the tweeter, but I wouldn't choose them over the CMT 340s. Let me just put it to you that way. If you get them, I think they're very good. If you need a speaker that's a bit more efficient, then that is a very nice choice. But you don't. And I still prefer the tweeter that's in the Ascend CM2340 SEs. I really like that tweeter. I think it's an absolute cut above at this price range. We're not worried about looks because they're going behind a projection screen. So your flat black is totally fine. Boxes are totally fine. So my answer to you is to stick with your original plan.
You have a good choice right now that can give you detailed and effortless, it sounds like.
I mean, you again, if you're really worried about it, you could benefit from a nice, solid amplifier because those CM2340s can handle 400, 500 watts, no problem. You know, peaks.
Wow.
Peaks.
So there's another recommendation for a big hoss of an amplifier.
That's what you're after. There you go.
There's like 2 or 3 questioners today, plus myself, who probably need a big hoss of an amplifier to do what we want.
Not that big.
Be kind of fun, though. I think my speakers say they can go to like a few hundred watts. I don't know. He had originally intended to put 2 subs in diagonally opposite corners, and he had it in mind that he would go with dual PC-4000s. But with some new plans in place, both rear corners are filled. So now he's thinking midpoints of the front and back walls, but with his false wall up front, it isn't deep enough for a PC-4000 to go behind his center speaker smack dab in the middle. So should he move it just off center so that it's beside his center speaker and then move the sub at the back just off center too? Is that close enough to still deliver good results? I would think so.
And yet the question is, with a 2,000 cubic foot room, why do you need PC-4000s?
He doesn't. I'm just saying that would deliver good results.
So yeah, that would be okay. You know,
in the sense that if you're digging a hole, a nuclear bomb will help.
A little offset is totally fine, but you don't need PC-4000s. You can say now if you want ridiculous overkill, but with a form factor,
and sometimes we do,
with a form factor that would fit behind your screen and below your center speaker. Let's say that you could go for SB3000s. Which is ridiculous overkill. If one of the reasons you wanted the PC-4000s is because you want the app control, well, the SB3000s still have that. You don't need ported in 2,000 cubic feet. You don't even need SB3000s. SB2000s would be totally fine output-wise, but I think he wants some overkill. I think he wants some crazy extension. I think maybe he wants the app. So SB3000s are less expensive than PC-4000s, and they could be smack in the middle and fit easily below your center speakers. That's one option. The other thing is you can just turn the cylinders onto their side and lay them down. And so if you're dead set on a PC-4000, just lay it down on its side and now it can fit below your center speaker.
But it wouldn't really affect things if it's off to the side.
No, that's
by
also
a little bit,
fine.
right?
But you don't need...
if he's dying for PC-4000s, get him for the bragging rights and then move it off to the side a little bit.
2,002 square feet or cubic feet.
You don't need it. But this isn't always about need.
We've come across that on this podcast, but
none of us really need any of this
Several
stuff.
solutions on that front, Ryan.
It is it's at the peak of that thing where it's like you got to have shelter and food and
air is important.
Maslow, who is that with the hierarchy of needs? Anyway, we're way up at the top with everything on AVRant. So off to the side is the answer. Brandon W has a question, and looks like I need to head on out after his stuff because he's got a few parts of this. Brandon W. Brandon has a large, irregularly shaped open room, and he has given us a picture of said room, and it is irregularly shaped, like a strange wedge. He's dealing with about 10,000 cubic feet. At the moment, he's using a single sealed 18-inch Dayton sub with an external Behringer EP4000 amplifier. He did a subwoofer crawl, so he got on the hands and knees, put the sub where he normally sits, and he found his best placement option was on the left wall just behind his seats. All right, and he shows us that too in the image. No one else in his family is complaining about bass uniformity. But he was thinking it would be nice to have the option to maybe add butt kickers to his seats or add some more subs and run the multi-sub optimizer software. He already has a UMI K1 and Room EQ Wizard. So here come his questions. The Behringer amp he's using to power his current sub offers XLR and TRS inputs. He's connected it directly to the subwoofer output of his Denon X6300H receiver, and that's working fine. But if he gets a mini DSP so that he can use the multi-sub optimizer software and or avoid sending an EQ'd signal to some butt kickers, should he get the regular version of the mini DSP or the balanced version? Would there be any issues using his balanced Behringer amp along with any subs that have their own amps built in? Or using the Behringer along with an unbalanced amp powering the butt kickers? Whew.
So I'm going to
That's a multi-layered
just
question.
kind of simplify this and say, just get the regular unbalanced mini DSP. Because on that Behringer that you have, so it's got this XLR input. We're familiar with that, with the 3 pins. And then the TRS input, the tip ring sleeve input, which is like your stereo 1/4 inch headphone jack.
Right.
That's what that input is. And since it's a stereo input, that is balanced as well. But right in the manual, it says, if you use a TS input, a tip sleeve input, which is a mono 1/4 inch jack,
Right.
that it
One of those over
will
there.
automatically treat that as an unbalanced signal, and it's good to go. It is totally fine accepting an unbalanced signal. You just need to use a TS 1/4 inch input instead of a TRS 1/4 inch input. So a mono 1/4 inch jack instead of a stereo 1/4 inch jack. So all you would need is a mono 1/4 inch to regular RCA cable, which is totally available, or an adapter plug.
That's totally doable.
Or an
yeah.
adapter plug, and that's all you need. That will accept the unbalanced signal coming out of the mini DSP, and you can feed all of your unbalanced inputs into the mini DSP and also send the second unbalanced mini DSP output to another external amp that's powering your butt kickers, or to a subwoofer that has a regular RCA input. So that's really the answer there. Just as long as you use a TS mono input to the Behringer amp, you're good to go with the regular non-balanced mini DSP.
I love it when the answer comes down to get an adapter.
Yeah.
That's very nice. If he wants to try multiple subs and the multi-sub optimizer software, what subs and placement would we recommend for multiple subs and the multiple sub optimizer software?
In this very irregularly shaped room.
It is.
Yeah. Actually,
That's going to be
we can go ahead
complicated.
with the rest of that question and answer it all together.
Yes, the current 18-inch sealed sub is roughly a 21-inch cube. And there's no good place to put 1 or 2 more of those huge boxes. Those are big.
He doesn't want them in his dining room,
Yeah.
apparently. Yeah.
That's one of those kind of subs where you better build a cardboard box to see how big it
Nearly
is
2
before you
feet
buy
in every
something.
dimension. That's a big old cube.
That's bigger than it even sounds. He was thinking maybe 2 smaller subs up front, but could he mix those with his existing sub? Should he go with 3 identical smaller subs? Now, I know we've on this podcast talked about how you don't have to have exactly matching subs. It's just the optimal, the reason you're getting 2 subs is to equalize around the room. And so the frequencies that one sub can do that the other one can't won't be affected.
Yeah, as long as you have similar extension and output, then they don't have to be identical. I wouldn't want massively different subs, because then you essentially have only one sub at certain frequencies. But as long as they're similar extension and output, so it doesn't have to be an 18-inch sealed sub. It just has to be a sub that plays similarly deep and loud as that one. So I'm not going to say that you have to get rid of or move your existing sub. It can stay where it is. It can remain where it is. It probably has close to sufficient output. Now, looking up at the front of his room here, which he's saying about the only reasonable place to put a couple of subs, he doesn't have a ton of space. We can't do cylinders, which width-wise would fit, but they'd be too tall. He's got one of these gray screens. It looks like he's using it for ambient light rejecting purposes. So there's a window directly to the left of his screen. So he's using a gray projection screen with a very thin bezel there. But you couldn't put cylinders in front of that. They'd be too tall. And I'm thinking that, I don't know, I mean, I'm just eyeballing that as well. Is that what, maybe 1.5 feet of space between the center console and his tower speakers?
Maybe. 1.5 feet. Just kind of gauging it on the size of components in his cabinet.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean,
about
it's about
16,
the
18
width
inches.
of that center speaker, which is probably 17 inches wide.
Yeah.
Just eyeballing it.
Oof. That's
so
pretty narrow.
honestly, I mean, what I'll do, since I want to give you an option to at least look into, right? I will not guarantee that this will work, because I don't know the exact dimensions of sizes that you're working with here. But one of Power Sound Audio's ported 15-inch ones, particularly the downward firing one, because I'm also thinking aesthetics. I'm thinking part of this is aesthetics, and the forward firing one with the forward facing port and it doesn't even necessarily come with a grill unless you request one, and it's not pretty looking, but the downward firing one is a fairly decent, like plain black box thing, but it's not.
It's very simple looking.
It's not ugly, and it's a hair over 17 inches wide.
Yeah, 17 and a quarter.
17 and a quarter inches wide, and that's about the skinniest of a sub that has that level of output, which should be quite similar to your sealed 18-incher. So I'm mentioning that one. That's Power Sound Audio's V1510 DF for down firing.
Mm-hmm.
It goes for about $1,000 a piece. That's including shipping. So I can tentatively recommend that as an option to you. Now, will you, for certain, if you have two of those up front and continue using your 18-inch sealed sub, will you, for certain, with the multi-sub optimizer software, get really uniform linear bass? Nope. No guarantee.
No, you can't predict much of anything given this interesting shape of the room.
You're not far off of the Earl Geddes approach that we talked about last week, which is one sub in a corner, which, the one in the front left is pretty close to that front left corner. And then
it would essentially be in a corner.
One on the opposite wall across the room from it, which would basically be in your dining room. So we're not really doing that. But you do have the
I don't want to put that
you do
there.
have the sealed 18-incher at least away from that. And then the third sub in the Earl Geddes approach, you kind of put as far away from the first two as you possibly can, which would basically be way over to the right there into that area that leads off into the adjacent room.
If you could put it next to the little cabinet on the other side of the door, maybe. Or what would happen if he put it behind the right-hand side of the couch?
Maybe. If you have the ability to try this stuff. But the multi-sub optimizer software, what it does is it measures each sub individually. It uses the software to calculate what EQ and phase settings it needs to make for each sub individually. Each of the three subs gets a different EQ and phase setting. And it tries to manipulate all that to give you the most uniform response that you can get. And then you still use your room correction to apply one global EQ to that,
right.
Because it's aiming for uniformity, not necessarily linearity, which is the great thing about that software. That's exactly what we want. So you still you can use one global EQ to get the linearity after it's gotten the best uniformity that it can. So no guarantees here about anything. I don't know if those subs I recommended will actually physically fit nicely, but there's a better chance than any others, because all the other ones are over 18 inches wide. Some of them are 20 inches wide. Doesn't really help you. And then no guarantees that the three subs in those positions with the multi-sub optimizer software will absolutely work, but there's a better chance. A better chance than two subs in this room.
The practicalities of life just really get in the way with what we want to do. You have a house, you have a room, things just have to fit. And sometimes there are compromises. You may never get this perfect, but I like that idea.
Also the possibility of since no one else is complaining and you get the primary seat and you did the subwoofer call for your seat and you are the only one who really cares,
don't worry about it.
You maybe just leave things as is.
Just leave it.
And if you're like, I want more tactile punch, which I could only get by having more output, which is probably too much output for the house as a whole, then the idea of butt kickers is a very nice idea. And yes, I am totally in favor of, you have applied EQ to the signal that is being sent to that current subwoofer. You don't want that same EQ being applied to the butt kicker, because the butt kicker doesn't need to be equalized. So that is where the miniDSP solution is perfect, because you do the equalization for the sub in the miniDSP, and then you can have a second output feeding just the butt kicker that has no EQ applied, and that's ideal.
And also, it's almost guaranteed the family will notice butt kickers, and at least they will be amused.
And they'll probably think it's fun.
It's kind of fun. It's kind of a conversation piece. So yeah, if no one else is complaining and you're happy, buy some butt kickers and just have some fun.
So I think that wraps it up. We have Joseph H, who wrote to us on Twitter, and Alvin C, who sent in a question and some pictures. You're on the list. I'll answer you next week when Richard Gunther will be here. I want to mention that once more. Please send in. If you have any home automation questions, now is the perfect time to send them in. I'll be recording the podcast with Richard from the Home On podcast on July the 24th. So you've got 1 week from the time we're recording this. And if you're hearing this this on Friday from the audio only, well, you got the weekend. Get them in over the weekend. We'll be recording on the Wednesday.
I'm going to try to submit some sort of questions because there's all kinds of ideas.
Please do.
So many ideas. I'm an idea guy. I'm not an action guy. I don't actually do much. Boy, I've got ideas.
But we always around here answer home theater and AV questions, and if you want those answered, just send them to question@avrant.com, our email address. That's the place to hit us up. We want to thank our listeners of the week. Once again, if you'd like to donate via PayPal, some people might have. I'm sorry I don't have your names in front of me because Tom has those names, but over at avrant.com, our website, that's over on the right-hand side where you can send us a PayPal donation. Want to thank our 82 Patreon patrons from patreon.com/AVRant Podcast for their automatic monthly donations. Brandon W is one of them, so thank you very much. And Brandon also bought some Hios products from Accessories for Less and let them know that he heard about them from us, so thank you for that, Brandon. We appreciate it. And big thanks to our guest co-host here this week, Lee Overstreet. Thank you so much for filling in.
You are very welcome. This is always fun. It was an adventure this week for sure with this new setup that you're having to deal with.
That was a hassle.
I'm still shook. I'm shook by the dirty words I heard you say, Rob.
No one has ever said them before I did. They're brand new.
You invented new ones. I mean,
there was one I said that wasn't dirty at all that I don't recall offhand, but you had never heard before. That was a genuine thing.
It was some Jeebus thing. I don't know. It wasn't even
that.
It was really weird.
Now I can't remember. It's something I say all the time.
No, I can't remember.
In any case, yes. Even our title, which I have left up here, were we even recording at that time? I don't think we were even recording at the time.
We were mostly just panicking.
It was a lot of panic on my end on this time. Trying to get these pictures up inside of OBS was a whole
I remember.
thing.
Yes, you were seeing the lip sync situation happening, right? Weren't you talking about lips?
Oh, there was that.
There you go.
Wasn't it Jeezum Crow? Wasn't that what I said?
Jeezum Crow. That's what Jeebus, Jeezum, whatever. Close enough.
I can't believe
you were being so naughty.
I can't believe you've never heard Jeezum Crow before. That is.
No, I mean, that's just not our thing down
here. That should be the name of this time. At least we've said that now on the podcast. That's what it should be. I'm changing it.
I liked OBS Lips. I don't know. Either one. Either one is good.
In any case, thank you very much, Lee. On behalf of Tom Andrew, enjoy your vacation, Tom, because it's well-deserved. On behalf of him, thank you very much, everyone. This has been AVRant.
Yes. And that's Rob.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm Lee. And
I never said that. I'm Rob H.
Yeah, and I'm Lee Overstreet. But go out and listen to something.
That's right.
Yeah.
Want your question answered? Send it to question@avrant.com. This is AVRant.
Now go out and listen to something.